Please welcome your panel on Global Overview, Measuring the Winds of Change, moderated by New York Times columnist Nicholas Kristof.
Thank you all very much for coming. We have an hour to solve the world's problems, and we'll do our best. We have an all-star panel for that. Let me introduce them now. On my right, we have His Excellency President Paul Kagame of Rwanda. To his right, we have Jane Harman, a longtime member of Congress and international affairs expert who is now the CEO of the Wilson Center in Washington. To my left, we have Lord Mandelson, a longtime British Labour politician, a senior Labour politician, and later the European Trade Commissioner. And on your far right, Michael Pillsbury, a longtime China hand who is at the Hudson Institute, advises President Trump, and also author of what I'm told is the top-selling book about China, 100-Year Marathon, unfortunately displacing one of my own from years ago.
I'm sorry.
Apology accepted. One of the issues that is attracting a lot of attention in the U.S. and around the world is China, concern about the Belt and Road Initiative, concern about the rise of China, how we manage that from trade to security issues. And President Kagame, let me start with you, because frankly, in the West, there is some anxiety about China's presence in Africa that is seen as part of the problem. And I think you see it somewhat differently. I'd like to maybe start, if you can, if you think that we in the West are overreacting to China's outreach.
Well, thank you, Nicholas. First of all, the problem of anxiety by the West relating to China or China's involvement in Africa has more to do with the West than with Africa. And therefore, that means the competition or whatever it is between the United States or the industrialized world with China finds Africa caught in between, meaning China and the West. But Africa has its own needs and its own interests as well, whether we want to see it that way or not. Now, the concerns I have had speak to, let's say, debt trap, which countries talk about, that Africa will find itself because of the debt, the huge debt that Africa is taking from China. That might have its own merits and needs to be looked at. But I would rather think the concern should come from, first and foremost, Africa, not from outside of Africa. Because, and the questions will be also raised. Why is Africa taking on this huge debt? So there are a number of things that have to be answered. It's important that Africa, if it is taking debt from anywhere, it is debt that is going to be invested in productive assets that will enable Africa to repay the debt in the first place. If it's not that, then Africa should not be taking debt from anywhere, whether China or anywhere else. And of course, Africa has not had debt just from China. It has had it from the traditional donors, even though in the recent past there was debt forgiveness. But that debt forgiveness was there because there was debt. Now, if you look at across Africa and then say, okay, Africa has had huge debt, either from the traditional donors or from China. But the question is always going to be, what has Africa been doing with this debt? And that can only be answered by Africa. Otherwise, the question of saying, no, we are worried, Africa will be trapped in debt with China, and so on and so forth. It sounds like concern for Africa by the outsiders than Africa being concerned for its own well-being. So which has in itself is a problem.
But, Mr. President, isn't it fair for the West to express concern when it sees Chinese networks, for example, using bribery to build large infrastructure projects, as we've seen in a number of places, to build what seems to be a naval base in Djibouti, causing concern? And there is a sense that those countries are, riding the back of the tiger, and to use a Chinese expression, may end up inside.
Well, the assumption here is that corruption is confined to China and Africa. That the West, does not get involved in corruption, which is not true. There are many examples, especially if you go to West Africa. We have many examples of other parts. But I'm not saying that nobody should give excuse for corruption or for things like that. I think corruption should be fought wherever it comes from. It's a bad thing. In fact, that's what we have been trying to do in our own country, and I know in some other African countries. So again, it goes back to the same point. If one was to tell Africans not to take debt from China, fine. That may be a good point. Provide the alternative. Because my assumption is debt should not be taken for the sake of it, for the sake of debt. It must be debt to enable Africa to invest in those areas that are important to Africa. Now, if it is not the case, then debt should not come from anywhere. But if it shouldn't come from China, it should come from somewhere else. Is the West willing to provide the kinds of capital that Africa requires for its development? If this was the case, then I'm sure, and I agree with the people. In actual fact, my thinking is that Africa, my own country, really look to the West as partners of choice or investors of choice in Africa. But it's more complicated than that. I wish the West was actually doing the investments that are required in Africa the way they should be. Then things, I think, would be clearer, and Africa would stop being caught in this instead trap of competition or whatever it is between China and the West.
Michael Pillsbury, you've taken a tough perspective on China for a long time, and it's one that has broadly gained ground. And I'm among those who, over time, has become more suspicious of Chinese motivations. And I think it's striking that in foreign policy, President Trump's policy toward China is one of those areas where I think there's actually fairly broad support. I think people, in many cases, wish that on trade that he were more multilateral, but in general, the idea of being tougher on security, the South China Sea, being tougher on trade, maybe also speaking up about the largest internment of people based on religion in the world since the Holocaust in Xinjiang. That's gained ground, and you were kind of a pioneer in that. So, can you talk about about your perspective on how we manage the China relationship and whether the world and the markets have adequately appreciated the risks?
Well, there are what I would call the national security moderates in the Congress. I think Jane Harman is one of them. She's going to say something about a friend of hers who's also an outstanding example of this. One of the members of Congress who's toughest on China is Nancy Pelosi. She opposed China joining the World Trade Organization at the time. She's been instrumental in giving voice to the Dalai Lama and his exile government. 7 senators from the Democratic Party wrote a letter to President Trump recently to be tougher on China in trade matters. There's been bipartisan proposals, quite a few actually, to crack down on technology transfer. A reform of the committee that oversees Chinese investment coming into our country was backed on the Senate side by Dianne Feinstein. Even though it was seen as a kind of conservative initiative, it immediately had co-sponsors from the other side. When it passed the House of Representatives, the vote was 400 to 4. You don't see that kind of vote in our House of Representatives. So I think there is broad support for being tougher on China. The question is how far to go. Do we really want to demonize China completely, to say they do no good at all, that when they loan money to Africa, it's really subversive and evil? Do we want to declare a new Cold War against China? I think not. I think there's very little support for going that far. But then being too weak could also have its its downside. So finding this magic area in between, I think, is what in the last couple of years of President Obama, he started doing that. Tony Blinken at State Summit Defense began to talk about returning to the great power competition, mainly against China. Went even further under Secretary of Defense Mattis, who gave a number of speeches where he said terrorism is not the main threat anymore. North Korea and Iran are not the main threat anymore. Our new Defense Department strategy puts China at the top. So I think somewhere in that zone is what President Trump has already written about before he took office. He used a wonderful phrase, which I have borrowed in my book: good China, bad China. Very simple, very Trumpian, if you will. Not sophisticated and cosmopolitan, just good China and bad China. And then he's been spelling out as president what he wants to do in each of those areas.
But, I mean, the notion of the good China, the bad China has been, maybe not expressed that way, but it's certainly been known. And I mean, for decades, people have tried to nurture the good China by bringing it into WTO, making it a stakeholder. I mean, there were all kinds of approaches.
Very, very naive in retrospect.
Yeah, but so those efforts largely failed. And so, you know, I agree with your diagnosis, but I don't really know how it's hard for me to see a trade deal that will really change the Chinese economy or trade relationship in a fundamental way. It's hard for me to see how we avoid China turning the South China Sea into a collection of unsinkable aircraft carriers. It's hard for me to see how we get Xi Jinping to lighten up on human rights and repression. So how do we actually make this happen?
Where's the magic spot? You have to think about cooperation first. If you don't think about cooperation with China, you lose a lot of players in our domestic political system. That said, the areas of competition have been terribly, terribly neglected. Who realized that we have over 100 agreements with China to transfer our scientific discoveries to them immediately? We had an office in Beijing, Jane, that was funded by Congress of the National Science Foundation to immediately transfer any new American scientific discovery to the Chinese government. There's a long, long list of these areas of inadvertent support for China, for which China never gave us credit for. And this is one of the areas President Trump and legislation is also focused on this. We're trying to cut back on this inadvertent support. And the reason for this is something Henry Kissinger has said quite wisely. He never anticipated this massive growth rate could be sustained for 30 years. You could find economists back in the 70s who said China has no hope. They will always be, at best, 10% of America's GDP. They won't even be a global player. All those people were wrong, but we don't have a kind of war crimes trial where we put economists in jail for bad forecasts. Otherwise, I think a lot of them would still be there.
Very tempting, very tempting.
So getting China wrong before was explicable because who knew Mao's wife, the so-called Gang of Four, what you've written about, who knew their economic policy to keep China pure, to still forbid all foreign investment, to not let any foreign companies come in. That point of view, if Mrs. Mao had won and her team had run China for the next 40 years, we wouldn't have this problem of geopolitical competition. But in a very mysterious way that's only becoming clear in the last couple of years, the other side won. And they quite quickly welcomed foreign investment, foreign economists, the World Bank's largest office in the world, far larger than the World Bank's office in Rwanda. The largest in the world is in Beijing. And they helped design China's economic policy for the next 35 years. The head of the World Bank at the time in 1980 was Bob McNamara, perhaps feeling guilty for the Vietnam War. He was the first World Bank president to visit Beijing and start them on the right track for economic growth. So this was not understood. It's hard to say it was an intelligence failure because the Chinese themselves didn't know about this, the outcome of the power struggle. So we look at China today, is there another struggle going on against President Xi that wants reform? Far more reform laid out in a study called China 2030 about 10 years ago. The President Trump trade strategy, Ambassador Lighthizer has explained in his testimony, both House Ways and Means and Senate Finance. He said, we're banking on the reformers in China supporting President Trump's 150-page deal because it will strengthen their hand to move China more toward free market policies. That's a gamble.
Jane, you've written very eloquently about the U.S. Looking inward, and at a time when the world is moving on. And, you know, I think you and I first got to know each other around the time of Darfur, and the president of Sudan, President Bashir, wanted for genocide, has just been toppled. The U.S. has largely been absent from any kind of influence on Sudan about what to do with him. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia and the UAE have been very present. They're encouraging some kind of continuation of military rule. I wonder, you know, I cited that, and I wonder, can you just talk a little bit about this, the U.S. retreating? It was something that happened beginning really under President Obama, certainly magnified under President Trump. What that means for American influence around the world.
Sure, I can. Let me just first say a couple things, though, Nick, if you don't mind, which is the need for leaders. I think about the unspeakable genocide in Rwanda before President Kagame and the climb out of the ditch to a functioning government with, last time I looked, a majority female legislature. I think that's right. Good for you. It's a good start. And a lot of progress in a region that has the only youth bulge that's going to lead to a majority population, I think under 25 in the near term. The rest of the world seems to be shrinking, and Africa, especially Southern Africa, is growing. But the absence of leadership elsewhere, 2 points. Nick's newspaper, which is not failing, I thought I'd point that out at least. I read it and buy the print edition, I hope you do, has a lead editorial today about a guy named Dick Lugar, who was, I'd say, the last bipartisan foreign policy leader, maybe John McCain you could put in that group, but in the Congress, who lost re-election a couple terms ago because he was too moderate, and he was defeated from the right, and then that person lost his election to a Democrat. But that's not my point. My point is about Lugar and the leadership he offered. And today, you can hear it in my voice, we lost a former member of Congress and my good friend, Ellen Tauscher from Northern California, who was elected 2 terms after me and who was called, we always used to laugh, the Jane Harman of the North. And that only meant that we were moderates, as Michael has pointed out. We believed in a strong defense. We were actually Scoop Jackson Democrats, for those oldies in the room who remember Scoop Jackson from Washington State. And it is just so sad to think that the leaders are falling and that the future in this country is less bright. And let me explain. This is not a partisan comment, or I don't intend it to be. What I wrote about recently was that as we stay focused on the Mueller report and impeachment, pro and con, we are not paying attention to the emergencies in the world that need our attention. Certainly one of them is in Africa. Africa needs help. This is what President Kagame just said. Who's offering the help? China. We're not. Why shouldn't they invest in Africa? In Europe, Europe wants to move to 5G. Who's offering the help? China. We're losing on 5G. In Venezuela, I'm going to get to your question. Civil war broke out today. Did anybody notice? We are supporting the insurgents. What are we doing about that? Whether that's a good idea or a bad idea. That just happened today. North Korea, Putin, I could list all the emergencies, the fact that Baghdadi is back and claiming that ISIS, even without a caliphate, is alive and well in the world, and I believe that. So then you go to Sudan. What are we offering in Sudan? Nothing. After the bleak years, the horrible years of suffering in Sudan. And we didn't offer much, and we're still not. I guess we're on the opposition side now in Libya. Just let's put that in the mix, which has a failing government and which easily could be, again, a staging ground for terrorism across North Africa and the Middle East. So this is a tragedy. And if you try to think about China, and I actually agree with Michael, who was at the Wilson Center last week. We all worked together in Washington, which is a good thing. I agree with Michael. I would say we were naive after the Cold War ended. This would be my take. We thought there would be order with the U.S. as the only superpower, and we missed the movie. And the movie was China moving, at least China we're talking about, moving to a new economic model, which we didn't think would happen, and Russia nursing wounds, which even though it's a weak country, enable it to act asymmetrically in ways where we're weak and use its strength against our weakness. And we're seeing this play out with Putin, and we're certainly seeing Xi and China rise in ways we don't fully understand. And on the last comment, Michael mentioned Henry Kissinger, whom I saw last week, who said, Henry Kissinger could be viewed as the guy who made peace with China, yes, but he also now says we need to be tough with China in certain ways. Michael outlined them. And we need to find concepts where we can work with China on the way forward. Because making an enemy of China, starting a new Cold War, doesn't seem, at least to me, to make any sense at all.
So how do we address this problem? Because, indeed, right now we see it in terms of Trump administration foreign policy, but President Obama reflected some of those same threads in his foreign policy. And fundamentally, they seem to me to reflect an American public that, to some degree, has tuned out the rest of the world, is very inwardly focused, there's a certain fatigue with global affairs, and I don't know how we fix that.
Well, I think there's a fatigue with endless wars. I mean, the longest war in history is happening right now in Afghanistan and Iraq, or I guess those are, I don't know if they're one war or two wars, but the longest U.S. military engagement is there. Congress is AWOL. Congress has become, by and large, a re-election machine, not the lead on foreign policy and defense issues that it has been at some points in its past. Again, think Scoop Jackson and others. And our leadership, it seems to me, has been, it's starting with, I don't know if it started with Obama, but I think our leadership has been much more hesitant to engage the world. There's a good reason to engage the world. There's a good reason for American leadership. I'm not saying in terms of military engagement. we have, I think, the best ideas about, and I don't know if President Kagame agrees with me, but I think we have the best ideas about a world of opportunity, a world in which there are alliances, a world in which we, because of our richness, can provide so many resources to everyone else and at the same time do well. And we're just not showing that side.
Peter Mandelson, so at a time when the U.S. feels tremendously polarized, dysfunctional, we Americans look across the pond and
you feel it's a home from home.
Exactly. We sort of appreciate being able to look in a mirror and seeing, the same extraordinary dysfunction in Britain with seemingly somewhat similar roots. So maybe for starters, tell us what on earth is going to happen with Brexit and, with what seems to be a dysfunctional British political system.
Well, that's a very, very easy question to respond to, Nicholas, because I, like everyone else in my country, has not got an idea of how this will end. Okay, have you got that? This is the most extraordinary strategic decision that affects our country at every single political, economic, and social level, and 3 years on from that decision in 2016, we are almost no further forward in working out and agreeing what future relationship we are going to have with the European Union now than we were then. That is how serious the paralysis is, and it's a paralysis which comes from the pretense that something which is in effect a religion felt by a minority in Britain, it's a sort of pathological, nationalist, anti-European, sovereigntist, take back control religion, the pretense that that is actually a policy. It isn't a policy, it's a religion. And to try and draw out of that sort of religion a sort of sane, stable, rational, unifying course forward that is going to maintain our trade in what is our biggest, nearest home export market in the world. 500 million odd European single market is Britain's home export market. It's the principal source of our investment in our country. It's the principal passage back and forth across non-existent borders of our manufacturing supply chains. And Nicholas, we have no better idea now than we did 3 years ago how that trade and those supply chains and that investment is going to be sustained in the way it has been previously. We know that leaving the European Union will eliminate our influence in Europe and therefore, as everyone accepts, reduce our influence in the rest of the world, but also our security is also at stake. Yes, we remain members of NATO, which your president has previously described as obsolete, a view I do not profoundly disagree with. But our security comes not just from a military capability and collective strength. It comes from intelligence sharing. It comes from police work. Mm-hmm. It comes from tracking terrorists. It comes from sharing data about people, who are moving and using our international transportation system, on which we rely on partners in those police agencies and intelligence community amongst our neighbours to give us the wherewithal to protect ourselves from bad people coming to do us harm, just as those European neighbours rely on us in Britain, and we are an intelligence superpower, frankly, in European terms. They rely on us and that instant, complete free sharing of data that is at the heart now of effective security, and we are endangering that as well. So how this ends, I cannot tell you. At the moment, as I said, we are in a state of paralysis. We are undergoing a democratic crisis in Britain over this. In my view, it can only be resolved by allowing the public back into this decision. Yep. I don't know when.
With a second referendum?
I don't know how or when or what terms, but given the stasis that exists within and between the parties and in Parliament, in my view, the public have to be let back in to this decision. And we will either, at the end of the day, have either to revoke our decision to leave the European Union or re-vote on that decision and give the government a clear mandate either way as to what to do and how to transact this extraordinary decision we took in a blink of an eye on one day in June in 2016 for reasons only some of which had anything to do with our membership of the European Union.
Given your former role as Trade Commissioner for the EU, let me just ask a quick trade question. So there is...
I don't agree, by the way, in a lot of the assumptions you've been making about China. I mean,
let me drop my trade question and...
Well, I don't...
So what do you disagree with?
Look, I tell you what I disagree with.
Disagreement is always good on a panel.
I simply do not believe it is naive, and it was one of yours.
Yes.
And you agreed, you endorsed. I simply don't think it's naive to acknowledge that a country which, after a few centuries going AWOL, has now returned to economic preeminence globally, is a growing and dominant trade power in the world, a country with which 136 other countries in the world do more trade with China than they do with the United States. And it's naive not to take China into the world trade system, a rules-based international trading system, supervised and overseen by a multilateral organization like the World Trade Organization, which has rules which are agreed democratically by all these countries, which has dispute settlement machinery, which you can use when there is trade law breaking going on by countries. Now, before you jump down my throat, let me tell you that 10 years ago, as Europe's Trade Commissioner, I was a bit of a China hawk. I was a bit of a China hawk. I'll tell you why. Because I felt that China had entered the World Trade Organization, embraced its rules and its machinery, in the letter of what it was being required to do, without sufficiently adhering to the spirit too, as well as the letter, of what those rules and what that ethos and what those values and what that dispute settlement machinery meant in practice. So I was tough on China. But the idea that now we can somehow put China on the naughty chair, and say, look, there's good China and there's bad China, and we're going to reward good China and we're going to punish bad China. I don't want international relations conducted in that, what I would regard as a very naive way, any more than I want China, which is an emerging superpower, if not already having achieved that status in the world, taking it upon itself to decide that there's a good America and a bad America.
They do that.
And that China's going to sort of punish bad America and
exactly
reward
what they
good
do.
America. Nor do I want them doing that to Europe either. Look, the international system in this world is in disrepair. It is under pressure. It's not crumbling, it's not unraveling, but it's certainly on the back foot. And in my view, the international system that has been created since the Second World War, which has served us pretty darn well in most respects during that period, is going to be succeeded either by a chaotic and dysfunctional non-system, or it's going to be succeeded by a new system of which China plays a leading role, in which it is a leading partner alongside the United States and Europe as the main sort of regulatory superpowers in the world. That is the sort of international system. Inevitably, we are going to have to seek to recreate, to succeed the system that is under such pressure now. And in my view, that's where we should be putting our attention and energy, rather than trying to demonize China.
Whether or not there's a good China and a bad China, there are good panels and bad panels, and to avoid being a bad panel, we've got to move on and cover some more territory. But I appreciate the disagreement, and I welcome more. President Kagame, this is the 25th anniversary of the genocide in your country, as Jane mentioned earlier, and the developing world, including Africa, has made tremendous progress overall. And every day, another 300,000 people get electricity for the first time. About as many get access to clean water for the first time. To visit Rwanda now, it's remarkable how modern. You have drones delivering blood, this kind of thing. But the place where global development has fallen apart is in fragile and conflict-ridden states. And those include some of your neighbors. Burundi has been teetering on the edge of genocide a few times over the last half dozen years. And Congo is not only torn apart by conflict, but now has the second worst case or epidemic of Ebola. And if Ebola reaches the city of Goma on your doorstep, that will be a catastrophe. So how do we, we've kind of figured out how to get stable countries to develop. We haven't figured out what to do with those unstable countries. What do we do?
Well, I think what needs to be done is known, but it never gets to be done. And one would always hope that lessons are learned over the years from one problem to another, including my own country's problems, the tragic past. But every other day you see same things happening. I mean, let me quickly take an example of Libya, which was mentioned. With the Gaddafi, things were bad enough. Nobody wanted, everyone was thinking or wishing that there could be change for the better. But something happened. Gaddafi was removed, and then there was no replacement of Gaddafi with a better thing. It just became more chaotic up to this day. In fact, including today, if you look at, on one hand, you have a failing government in place, which, by the way, was supported or put there by the United Nations. They even called it United Nations supported government. At the same time, there is another force that has emerged from the eastern part of Libya. And now there is chaos going on. This force wants to take over Libya. And all of a sudden, the government that was in place, supported by the UN, the powerful members of the UN start siding with the other rebels who are trying to overthrow the government they put in place and supported. So it's confusing, absolutely confusing. Haftar, who is fighting in Libya, is supported by some powers in the West, or they want him to take over, but at the same time, the same powers subscribed to supporting this government that is in place, that is going to be overthrown. I mean, it's absolute confusion. You can't know what to expect. So what lessons are there? If you look at, use the case of Libya alone. Now, have lessons been learned? No. Now, in the case of the heart of Africa, if you look at Congo has had a history of problems for decades, including the recent times, political problems. Now, of course, what you said, Ebola steps in. And on both sides, be it the political problems that have been there, or now the health threat, which becomes a huge threat to not only Congo but the whole region, there is this absence of international system playing their part in trying to make things hold in the DRC, in the Congo, or in the region. So we're trying to have to do with what we can. In fact, what you mentioned, we are already seeing a situation where Ebola is indeed increasingly coming to Goma and therefore next door to Rwanda, and we have to prepare ourselves. But fortunately, over time, much as we sometimes have benefited from the support of the international system, the donors and others who have, invested with us and helped, put in place some of these things. But at the same time, we have also been relying on making sure that we build systems in our own country to actually, a level of resilience that when things don't go well with the outside being supportive, at least we have a chance of fighting it out ourselves and dealing with it. So we are already preparing whatever we have in the health systems, which we have built over the years with the support of the international community, to make sure that we can withstand this onslaught of the tragic situation that may be created by Ebola. So it's so many things. You find there is a lot of chaos going on, and we are having to go through a process of sorting out what we can do for ourselves, what we can do with others, and but the central line here to be emphasized is cooperation. It can't be overstated. I think there is a need to work together rather than work against each other, as we have seen across the world.
Jane, speaking of Libya, it seems that the president is on one side of the Libya civil war and the State Department on the other. And that may be because Saudi Arabia is on General Haftar's side. That, in turn, brings me to Saudi Arabia and Iran and the world's worst humanitarian crisis in the world today, which is Yemen. I wonder whether we have been, our fingerprints are on the starvation in Yemen because of our alliance with Saudi Arabia. I wonder if you think we need to re-examine that relationship. I wonder if you're also concerned about the risk of conflict with Iran in the Gulf.
Yes, and yes. Just to add one word to what President Kagame was just talking about, I hope that Africa is able to take responsibility for its future. But if you look at the so-called Arab Spring and you see what came after governments which weren't exactly appealing fell, what came after was worse government. To the extent there is government, it's pretty discouraging. But on this point, I totally agree. Congress did something, maybe you all missed it, but it actually voted on a majority basis and sent a amendment, or I guess it was a law related to the War Powers Act, to the White House a couple weeks ago, which would have prevented the U.S. from providing additional military assistance to Yemen in the war on Yemen. We don't have ground troops, but we do provide intelligence assistance, aerial refueling, and things of that nature, and we still do. At any rate, the bill passed both chambers of Congress and was sent to the president, and he vetoed it, and there was not a veto-proof majority in either house, so it didn't happen. But I totally agree with you, Nick, that our intervention on behalf of the Saudis in what is both a civil war and a proxy war in Yemen is colossally dangerous and inconsistent with the values we hold. I mean, we have helped to create a gigantic humanitarian crisis. It's not that Yemen didn't have problems before. I mean, it had problems with a drought. It didn't have strong government. There was a nascent civil war, but it wasn't a dysfunctional country. I went there about, I don't know when, 15 years ago maybe, and met with 4 reasonably organized political parties. You know, there was the functioning of a sort of let's not call it a democracy, but some form of political capacity there. And now there is nothing, and there's a gigantic cholera epidemic and so forth. So where are we going with this relationship with Saudi Arabia? Mr. Khashoggi was invited to be a scholar at the Wilson Center, and we expected that he would come in the near term. He has a lot of friends there. I didn't know him personally. It's devastating to think how he was murdered, and to think that there still is not responsibility taken at the senior levels of the Saudi government. I think that our close alliance there is problematic. I don't mean that we should have no relationship with Saudi Arabia. We should. But our close alliance there and our taking their side on Yemen is wrong. As for Iran, you asked, is there going to be a war with Iran? Well, I was, and maybe many of you disagree, but I was a proponent of the nuclear deal that we struck with the other powers in Europe and Russia and China. I was a proponent because at least it was containing the worst aspect of the Iranian government. We were hopeful that that would generate better relations all around, but that wasn't the deal we struck. It was a transactional deal, not a transformational deal. And to demonize Iran now and to take the guardrails off of what was a functioning agreement, I think is hugely dangerous. Are we going to war with Iran? I don't think so. But there's the danger, to me, of unintended war all over the world now. To remind, Woodrow Wilson was president 100 years ago when it's been 100 years, but 101 years, ended probably the most, catastrophic in terms of human damage war, World War I in our history and world history. Wilson campaigned for a second term saying we wouldn't go to war, then we went to war. Most people looking back on it don't really understand what the proximate cause was. And now we have nukes and other incredibly damaging weapons, including cyber and AI. And so I worry about unintended war more than I worry about deliberate actions to go to war.
So on Saudi, I think this is a colossal disappointment, what's happened. I really felt when those couple of years back when the Crown Prince set out his vision, it really was not just a major project to liberalize both Saudi's economy and its society, but it paved the way for a different role for Saudi to play both in the region and more widely. And I could not have welcomed it more. I couldn't have felt more enthusiastic about it. And therefore, I don't know whether it's a reversal we've seen, but it's certainly a loss of momentum in that direction is tragic, particularly for Saudi Arabia as a country, but for everyone else who has dealings with that country. And I don't believe, I think like Jane, you can't conduct a relationship with Saudi Arabia now as if nothing has happened. It's too big. And what we've got to try to do is to encourage Saudi Arabia and its leadership back onto that original path that the Crown Prince so ably set out.
Jamal was a friend of mine, so I think of him all the time.
So you understand that?
Yeah. Michael, we've managed to not really talk about North Korea, which is something that a year ago we would, it would have been at the top of the conversation. But at the end of the day, North Korea, is not testing weapons or long-range missiles, but it is still producing nuclear fuel for warheads. It is still apparently building missiles. It remains the most repressive country in the world today. Have we kind of devolved back into strategic patience? And I mean, at the end of the day, we tried, Democratic and Republican administrations have tried every possible policy toward North Korea, and essentially nothing has worked very well. So what do we do?
Well, I think North Korea falls into a larger framework that I agree with Jane Harman that we should all be aware of, which is the possibility of war breaking out in various places in the world. And as Jane said, accidental or inadvertent war, not something that people plan out because they want to grab an oil field or lithium for batteries. And North Korea is the front and center case where former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry and Ash Carter once wrote an op-ed piece. I think they chose the Washington Post, not the New York Times, unfortunately. But their op-ed piece was just how far President Clinton had gone down the road to the use of force against North Korea in 1994. That was escaped from, if you will, by a series of one-off events. Jimmy Carter injecting himself into the talks, the nature of the agreement. All this fell apart over the next 15 years. And to me, one of the most significant things President Trump did, and it was with at least the passive agreement of the Chinese, is to begin military maneuvers and letting people in the administration talk about the use of force in the northern part of North Korea, where purportedly the nuclear weapons sites are located. And then movements of ships and planes, as well as that. The South Korean defense minister publicly asked whether American nuclear weapons should be returned to South Korea. A lot of younger people here are probably thinking there were American nuclear weapons in South Korea. If you Google it, you'll see the number 800, and yes, they could be returned fairly easily. So talking about the military options seems to be part of the background for why Chairman Kim was willing to meet and go as far as he's gone. It seems to me, if you make a list of and we used to do this at Rand Corporation down the road here and in the office I was in the Defense Department for long-range planning, we used to make a list of the top 10 or top 20 most likely wars and what we were doing about them, if anything. In many cases, it was nothing. And yes, there are even possible wars in Africa that were considered scenarios worth planning. And what has happened more recently is the nature of warfare itself has changed. Jane mentioned cyber. Nuclear weapons are changing in their capabilities. The Trump administration has picked up on something the Obama administration left behind, the idea of low-yield nuclear weapons, which upsets the left because this makes it easier to use nuclear weapons. Conservatives like it because, in their view, it helps deterrence, that the Americans might really do this. So we have two huge cross currents on our topic of measuring the winds of change. If the nature of warfare itself is changing, so that weaker powers can now buy a lot more capability. The Iranians have bought a lot of things that makes them a really militarily powerful force. They were not 20 years ago. But on the other hand, the Chinese-American cooperation has gone up. China has helped enormously with North Korea. Maybe not enough, but President Trump has revealed that he's called President Xi more than 30 times. These calls are often an hour long. He's met with him at great length. So we have an example here of what I try to describe in 100-Year Marathon, that back in the 80s, CIA and the Chinese intelligence service were in a multi-billion-dollar program to drive the Soviets out of Afghanistan. That those involved know it succeeded. We were involved in a lesser-known program, I got permission to reveal, to drive the Vietnamese army out of Cambodia.
That was a deft reference to your book.
I have more references to my book to come. These are positive examples of what sometimes people call G2. No G8, no G20, G2. The two greatest economies in the world have worked together in the past, so now they focus on something like poaching in Africa. This has been a topic of discussion for several years, Rwanda in particular. Drones, funds, a tougher approach in China to not buying ivory. So that was a coordinated strategy Obama got started with an executive order. This is a possible future of the world. I don't want to be naive again, that's our loaded word maybe for this panel. But Chinese-American cooperation under the UN Security Council, this was supposed to be the dream of 1944, 1945. Preventing wars through the Security Council, earmarking forces to go stop aggression. Well, I don't want to forget that dream, and my first job actually was in the United Nations Secretariat. This causes problems with America's hawks when they hear that I used to work in the UN Secretariat. But that was the original plan that His Lordship alluded to. That's what the Chinese, to some degree, the good China signs up for that, preventing wars around the world with the Americans' help.
We're just about out of time, but I'd like to invite each of the panelists to just very quickly name an issue or a problem that we are not adequately focused on, that is a risk that the markets and pundits have not focused enough on, have not appreciated, or conversely, perhaps it's one that we are too worried about that is actually very unlikely, but something that kind of the consensus gets wrong. Jane, can I start with you?
Well, I mentioned the thing that concerns me most, which is the danger of unintended consequences. And I think again, we focus inward on impeachment, Mueller, the 2020 election, the rest of the world is going on without us with the most lethal weapons and a lot of irresponsibility. And we had guardrails in U.S. policy. We had a framework much more robust than we do now. And I'm not blaming all this on the Trump administration. So I worry about that.
Thank you. President Kagame, what is something that the world gets wrong, that the consensus gets wrong?
I say generally, I have a feeling Africa needs to get its act together and be a place that can raise its interests higher than where it is, its stakes, and do as much as possible to be one of the players on the global scene instead of always being caught up in the power games that we see across the world. And this is possible if Africa comes together and reasserts itself and stops being that place where people are told every day what to do, what not to do. And I think this is the main thing. And therefore become partners and get into cooperation with other countries or continents in the world. That's something that I think is very important.
Thank you. I would name the risk of naval conflict in the Gulf, or perhaps the way climate change will create risks of conflict in both the Arctic and Antarctic regions. Lord Mandelson.
Population. How a combination of swelling, burgeoning populations in emerging continents and countries and economies in the world, a quest for economic opportunity amongst those people, the very, very damaging impact of climate change is going to spark massive movements of people. I already see in Europe how this is sparking a rebellion, a backlash, which we call identity politics. We have got to find a way, in cooperation with those countries, we in the West have got to find a way of managing population movement which will require more than a tweak of the policy dial.
Michael Pillsbury, you have the last word.
I think economic security and national security have been treated separately by our government, by most governments. Some presidents, like Paul Kagame, have unified them, but that's leading toward the erosion, even the breakdown of what used to be called world order. It was supposed to be a system of world order all the way back to 1815, the great powers meeting, deciding things, avoiding major war. As that's eroded, it looks like economic security and national security are pretty much the same thing and ought to be treated the same way by the governments of the world.
Well, that is the state of the world. We haven't entirely resolved all the world's problems, but we did our best. Please join me in thanking our panel today.